On June 25, 2025, a 79-year-old man walked through the final hours of his life inside one of America's most storied prisons. He had been on death row for nearly half a century, longer than any other inmate in Mississippi history. This is the story of his last 24 hours. Richard Gerald Jordan was born on May 25, 1946, in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. He grew up in the small town of Petal, where neighbors remembered him as a well-regarded young man. After high school, he enlisted in the U.S. Army, serving 3 voluntary tours of combat duty in Vietnam between 1966 and 1969. When he returned home, he was a different person. Years later, he would be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition that advocates argued had never been properly heard in a court of law. In January 1976, Jordan kidnapped Edwina Marter, the wife of a Gulfport bank loan officer, in a failed ransom scheme. He shot and killed her and was arrested the following day. Tried 4 separate times across several decades due to legal challenges that overturned prior sentences, Jordan was ultimately sentenced to death for the final time in 1998. He became Mississippi's oldest and longest-serving death row inmate, spending nearly 50 years awaiting execution. The 24 hours leading up to Jordan's execution were marked by a flurry of last-ditch legal activity, all of which ultimately failed. On the Monday before the execution, the U.S. Supreme Court had already rejected one petition arguing that Jordan had been denied due process rights related to mental health evaluation. His legal team, led by Chrissy Nobile of Mississippi's Office of Capital Post-Conviction Counsel, had long argued that Jordan was never provided an independent mental health professional during his trials, a right his attorneys said the law had entitled him to for years. Because of this, they argued, no jury ever heard about the severe psychological toll of his Vietnam service. On the Tuesday before the execution, just one day out, the 5th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals ruled against Jordan, upholding a lower court decision that allowed the execution to proceed as scheduled. Jordan's attorneys had argued that Mississippi's 3-drug lethal injection protocol posed a substantial risk of causing unnecessary pain. The court ruled that this claim could not be proven to the required legal standard. On the morning of June 25th itself, Jordan's lawyers filed a last-minute certiorari petition directly with the U.S. Supreme Court, challenging that same 5th Circuit ruling. The Supreme Court denied it without comment. Separately, a clemency petition had been submitted to Mississippi Governor Tate Reeves. It was written by Franklin Rosenblatt, a professor at Mississippi College School of Law and president of the National Institute of Military Justice. The petition included letters from more than a dozen supporters, including Jordan's wife, his sister, and a pastor. It argued that Jordan's diagnosed PTSD, stemming from 3 back-to-back combat tours, was a significant mitigating factor that no jury had ever been allowed to weigh. Governor Reeves denied the clemency request. He did not issue a public statement. There was one notable legal footnote. U.S. District Judge Henry Wingate had issued an order requiring that if the first drug in Mississippi's 3-dose protocol did not render Jordan unconscious within 4 minutes, prison officials would be required to pause and consult the court before proceeding. That condition was ultimately not triggered. By the afternoon of June 25th, every legal avenue had been closed. What is publicly known about Richard Gerald Jordan's final day comes primarily from official statements by the Mississippi Department of Corrections and from media reports filed by journalists who were present at the prison. During an afternoon press conference at Parchman, Superintendent Mark McClure told reporters that Jordan appeared to be in a, quote, good mood. According to McClure, Jordan was talkative and was sharing stories about his past. Prison officials did not elaborate on the nature of those conversations. Jordan received his last meal at 4 p.m. His meal consisted of chicken tenders, French fries, strawberry ice cream, and a root beer float, all officially reported by the Mississippi Department of Correction. Jordan was accompanied in his final hours by his wife, Marcia Jordan, who had submitted a letter on his behalf in the clemency petition. His attorney, Chrissy Nobile, was also present. And in accordance with a 2022 U.S. Supreme Court ruling that granted death row inmates the right to have a spiritual advisor present in the execution chamber, Jordan was accompanied by the Reverend Tim Murphy, his designated spiritual advisor. The Marter family's attendance was divided. Edwina Marter's husband Charles and her 2 sons Eric and Kevin did not travel to Parchman to witness the execution. Eric Marter, who had been 11 years old when his mother was killed, told the Associated Press before the execution, "It should have happened a long time ago. I'm not really interested in giving him the benefit of the doubt." Edwina's brother planned to attend, and after the execution, her nephew Keith DeGruy read a written statement on behalf of the family, addressing the impact of Edwina Marter's loss on all of those who loved her. 7 media witnesses were present in the execution chamber. The execution was carried out at the Mississippi State Penitentiary in Parchman, also known as The Farm, one of the oldest and most well-known prisons in the American South. The method was lethal injection, using Mississippi's 3-drug protocol. The first drug administered was midazolam, a sedative. The second was a paralytic agent. The third was a drug intended to induce cardiac arrest. The process began at 6:02 p.m. Central Time on June 25, 2025. Prison officials and media witnesses confirmed that Jordan was rendered unconscious by the first drug. The order issued by Judge Wingate, requiring a pause if consciousness was not achieved within 4 minutes, was not invoked. Officials stated that the process went smoothly. Richard Gerald Jordan was pronounced dead at 6:16 p.m. Central Time. He was 79 years old. According to Wikipedia's reporting, he was the oldest person to be executed in the United States since the 2018 execution of 83-year-old Walter Leroy Moody Jr. Jordan's last meal, as officially reported, consisted of chicken tenders, French fries, strawberry ice cream, and a root beer float, served at 4 p.m. When given the opportunity to make a final statement as the execution began, Jordan spoke clearly. His last words, as reported by media witnesses and confirmed by the Mississippi Department of Corrections, were, "First, I would like to thank everyone for a humane way of doing this. I want to apologize to the victim's family." He then thanked his lawyers by name, told his wife that he loved her, and concluded with, "I love you all very much. I will see you on the other side, all of you." Jordan's case had drawn significant attention from legal advocates, veterans organizations, and anti-death penalty groups in the months and days leading up to his execution, and that attention intensified in the final 24 hours. The central controversy was not about Jordan's guilt. He had admitted to the crime and his guilt had never been seriously disputed. The debate centered on two issues: the length of time he had spent on death row and the question of whether his documented PTSD from Vietnam combat service had ever been adequately considered by any court. Advocates from Death Penalty Action delivered petitions to the governor's office the day before the execution. The Catholic Mobilizing Network also circulated calls for clemency. Franklin Rosenblatt, who submitted the formal clemency petition, stated publicly that Jordan's war trauma was considered not relevant in his murder trial, and argued that knowledge of PTSD and its effects on behavior has advanced enormously since the 1970s. Chrissy Noble, Jordan's attorney, said her client was never provided the independent mental health evaluation the law required. After the execution, Attorney General Lynn Fitch stated that her office had pressed for justice and was pleased to provide the Marter family and the community with closure. Eric Marter, Edwina's son, said he did not accept the PTSD argument as a defense. "I know what he did," he told reporters. "He wanted money, and he couldn't take her with him." As of early 2025, Jordan was one of 22 people in the United States still on death row who had been sentenced in the 1970s, according to the Death Penalty Information Center. His execution was noted nationally as a landmark case in the ongoing debate over the length of time inmates spend on death row, the use of capital punishment for elderly inmates, and the adequacy of mental health consideration in capital trials. Richard Gerald Jordan spent 49 years on death row, longer than many people live entire lifetime. He was convicted of a brutal crime that took the life of Edwina Marter and shattered her family. The facts of that crime were never in serious dispute, and yet his case became, in its final hours, a focal point for broader questions that continue to define the American death penalty debate. Questions about whether a fair trial can truly occur when mental health evidence is excluded. Questions about what justice means when an execution comes nearly half a century after the crime. Questions about whether the state can call a process humane when the condemned man himself uses his last breath to say that it was. None of those questions have easy answers. They are questions that democracy must continue to wrestle with, openly and seriously. What is certain is this: on June 25, 2025, at 6:16 p.m., the state of Mississippi carried out an execution that had been nearly 50 years in the making. A woman named Edwina Marter died in a forest in 1976. Her family waited decades for what the law called justice. And a 79-year-old man who had once been a boy from a small Mississippi town and a soldier in a distant war reached the end of a long and complicated road. The record is now closed. The questions remain open. Subscribe to True Crime Death Sentence for more real death row stories.